Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I am very proud to welcome you to this final edition of our 2023-2024 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science seminar series. This lecture series has been supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA College of Arts and Sciences, the UVA School of Data Science, and through a grant from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. Since 2016, the Foundations of Biomedical Data Science seminar series has focused on the use of data science methodologies, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and statistical modeling as they pertain to differing themes in the biomedical and health sciences. Our chosen theme for this year is building partnerships for generative AI training in biomedical and clinical research, where we have enjoyed presentations on Fridays from a wide range of leading thinkers about the issues, promise, and opportunities and hurdles associated with the emergence of AI-based methods. Vitally important have been the efforts of faculty educators in training the next generation of biomedical researchers to properly utilize these new and ever-changing computational tools. Participants selected for our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program leverage these seminar presentations as vital material for the culminating in-person manuscript and grant development project workshop to be held at the Bahia Beachfront Resort located in sunny San Diego, California in June of 2024. We have been super excited about this year's program, very engaging, and bringing together AI platform developers, biomedical researchers, and university-level educators to better understand the power, promise, and potential perils associated with the generative AI explosion. Today, I am delighted to welcome the last speaker of this year's series, Dr. Adam Yala from the UC Berkeley and from UCSF. He is an assistant professor of computational precision health, statistics, electrical engineering, and computer science at UC Berkeley and UCSF. His research focuses on developing machine learning methodologies for personalized medicine and translating them into clinical care. He obtained his Bachelor of Science degree, his Master of Engineering, and his PhD in computer science from MIT, where he was a member of the MIT Jameel Clinic and the MIT CSAIL lab. His previous research has focused on two key areas: predicting future cancer risk and designing personalized screening policies. Adam's tools underlie multiple prospective trials, and his research has been featured in the Washington Post, New York Times, Stat, Boston Globe, and in Wired magazine. In continuing our 2023-2024 Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series theme, Dr. Yala's lecture today is entitled AI for Personal Cancer Care. For multiple diseases, Adam will tell us that early detection significantly improves patient outcomes. This motivates considerable investments in population-wide screening programs such as mammography for breast cancer and low-dose CT for lung cancer. To be effective and economically viable, such programs must balance early detection with overscreening. In his talk, Adam is going to talk about the different approaches to address this challenge by introducing novel methods for cancer risk assessment and personalized screening policy design. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. Also, our specially selected 2023-2024 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants and alumni are encouraged to submit any questions they have via the chat feature in their YouTube sessions. I will synthesize these questions and ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of the lecture. And with that, Adam, welcome. We are very, very excited to hear from you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So diving straight into it, let's talk about how cancer screening works today and how we can do better. So by and large, screening today across many diseases, including breast cancer, lung cancer, and others, is a one-size-fits-all strategy. No matter who the person is, be they, say, the patient here shown schematically in red, orange, or green, with very different mammograms, different kind of health profiles, we tell them to do the exact same thing. Get a mammogram every year, say starting the age of 50. Now, there's two harms here. One, roughly 1 in 3 of people following this guideline will still find relatively advanced cancer under the diagnosis. This means you're going to have more morbid treatment pathways, much lower quality of life, lower chances of survival. And if only we knew, we could have done more for these patients. We could have given them something like an MRI at the right timing and essentially ended the risk of advanced cancer. So the power of hindsight, we know we should have done more. At the same time, many other patients, and many more by number, will get only harm through the screening process and never find cancer. Over 97% of screening MRIs and greater than 99% of screening mammograms won't find cancer. And this accumulates to a lot of unneeded biopsies, patient anxiety, a whole lot of costs. And we know that for these patients, with the power of hindsight, we should have done less. So with that motivation in mind, I'm going to talk to you about a very simple two-step plan of how we can do better in the space, both in breast cancer, but more generally. And the two-step plan breaks up into two parts. One, as I hinted, we need foresight. We need to understand who's going to get cancer. So this is from the image on the left, understanding who's going to get cancer in the future. And then given this kind of foresight information, we need to do something about it. We need to automate a tool to then make personalized screening policies so that we can actually catch cancer systemically earlier and do less overscreening. And I'll talk about each of these things as a core machine learning problem. So to dive into that, the first part of the talk is going to focus on the foresight part of the equation. And academically, we call this problem predicting cancer risk. And I really want to emphasize it's not looking at the image on the right and saying, oh, there's cancer there, where is it? It's the picture on the left when there's nothing visible, nothing that radiologists would try to biopsy today, and understanding this person is going to develop something and therefore could benefit from additional interventions. And this is the focus of a lot of work throughout my PhD, with citations sort of on the right across radiology, STM, and JCO. Now, this is in no way a new problem. People have been thinking about this since at least the late 1980s with the introduction of the Gale model. And by and large, our approach here, like it is in cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, many others, is all fully reliant on expert knowledge and traditional epidemiology. So what I mean by that, how do people think about cancer risk and what's used clinically today? Well, we know things like age matters as experts. The older you are, higher cancer risk. Family history matters. More family members imply something. We know if someone has a prior breast procedure that might matter. And people have even hypothesized that images contain something. And so since the late 1960s, people have characterized mammograms into these four categories, depending on how much fatty tissue they have in them. And they've basically made a feature vector of all this information, but all the work is all in the human feature design. So it all comes down to just a couple bits of information in the end. They put this into a simple model to predict risk over time. Now, the commonality across all of these models, and there's many variants of them since the late 1980s, is that all the work is on the human to ask the right question. They're usually implemented as questionnaires, and none of them are that great. I mean, these are normally measured via something called AUC, so area under the curve. The key point here is 50 is random, 100 is perfect, and 60 is really not that great. And even when you add in imaging, but only as a kind of a one of four categories, you only get a tiny bump in performance from 61 to 63. And despite decades of effort, improving over this has been really quite hard. Now, I will argue that kind of the key departure, and this still hasn't been adopted in many areas of medicine, is that this is fundamentally a learning problem. And if we just try to learn the function more directly and just say, let's take everything we know about a patient in its full resolution, let's understand the association of that signal directly to cancer, we can do much better. So the first example here is looking at a single mammogram. So beyond this kind of manual curated density category, we have patients who had imaging and through the normal standard of care, not have gotten cancer in 3 years, not at all in 5 years. And our job is just to learn this association. Now, before talking through the modeling details and some of the ideas that we're used to making this work, I want to briefly talk through some of the results, the use cases, and why why you should care and pay attention for the next couple of minutes. So the model I built is called Mirai. It's this mammogram-based model. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you a comparison against the kind of prior state-of-the-art from the clinical side. So this blue bar is called the TARA-QSIC. This is the 8th version. It has a very long, very detailed questionnaire, detailed family history, did someone's maternal cousin get ovarian cancer, and if so, at what age? Did they have any take-home therapy, et cetera? So many, many questions of all the expert knowledge people know. And all of that only gets you to a AUC in 5 years of 62. And remember, 50 is random, 100 is perfect. Compared to that, looking at just the image without any other information, just the single mammogram gets us to 76. And a 14-point boost in the space is really, really large. And importantly, this doesn't just work in Boston, where I built it during my PhD at MIT, but also the same model looks out of the box in SF, in Taiwan, in Israel, in Brazil, the Emory, in the US, and many other sites. And so it's really globally generalizable. Now, I want to highlight briefly one use case, okay, so the AUC numbers are better. A healthy question is, so what? It needs to be practical. And one ongoing prospective trial we're running right now with colleagues at UMass is selecting patients for MRI. So if you recall, if you have foresight, we can give patients MRI, and basically patients receiving this have a much lower risk of advanced cancer because MRI is a much more sensitive modality. Our current programs to do this have something like a 1.6% to 2% cancer yield, so they're very inefficient. Most of the MRs don't find anything. So we're taking a very high risk threshold, and we're trialing a new MRI program based on the model, and the very early preliminary data shows quite significant effects. Now, there's going to be a bunch of other use cases, and I'll touch on others in the context of in the context of lung cancer. But I think it's a good time to take a moment to talk about what actually is this model, and what are some kind of technical lessons that are useful in giving this general and robust performance. So at a high level, Mirai is just a model that takes input 4 images. Those are the 4 standard views of a mammogram. So it's 2 angles per breast with 2 breasts. And we're predicting risk of cancer within a year, within 2 years, within 3 years, 4, and 5. Now, under the hood, this is a combination. I built this back in 2019. It's a combination of convolutional networks and transformers. But the key bit that I think was really important to making this work is actually the learning algorithm in itself. So to expand on that, the first challenge we ran into was bias representations by device. So what I mean by this is that when originally working on deployments, on trying to plug in this model at MGH, we find that depending on the machine that acquired the image, the model is giving systemically different predictions. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you here a t-SNE plot of just the 5-dimensional risk scores predicted into 2 dimensions. And the colors here are different machines that acquire the image. So you can see that the way the risk score is being calculated is like totally confounded by the machine. And clinically, that's nonsense. And so our regular risk modeling objective did not eliminate this implicitly, and this is quite bad. So, but this plot also gives a hint of the solution. We can clearly see that there's a problem. And so given we can see it, we can measure it. And so introduce something called the discriminator that just looks at the model's representations to predictions to figure out which device it's from. And then we train against this, and then we augmented our training objective with both the risk modeling loss and also this adversarial loss. What we showed by doing so, we could fully eliminate this issue and get back to completely unbiased representations. So another way to measure this is you could say, well, how good is the classifier in telling red versus blue on the left-hand side? That had an AUC of somewhere in the low 80s. Once you go to the right, it's fully random, it's back to 50. So this is kind of one challenge that was quite important to resolve. The second one is the very way we model risk in itself. So if you recall, the nature of what risk means is a little bit different at different time intervals. So if you look at if you're trying to understand who has cancer within a year, what we were looking for is something like a tumor, right? Like that's basically detection. When you say within 5 years, you don't know exactly what it is. It's much harder, but you know it's not a tumor. You know something's quite different, and you need the flexibility to have different associations of what you're looking for in the image across different time intervals into the model itself. So while a traditional approach would say take something like proportional hazard, which seems like kind of a fixed relationship across all time points, in practice that works very poorly on images. And so the key idea here is that we can what does risk mean? Well, 5-year risk is 4-year risk plus a little more. 4-year risk is 3-year risk plus a little more. You can take this cumulative relationship, build it into the architecture itself, and then do log likelihood-based training. And this works robustly in practice. So there's a bunch of other ideas involved, but really these are the 2 key things I want to highlight that make this model practical, that gets both the boost over the baseline and generalizes more broadly. Now, I want to emphasize this is not a breast cancer specific story. We have essentially very similar results in the context of lung cancer. So there, the stories are a little bit different, but nearly the same. Like in breast cancer, the traditional approach, the things that help run our clinical guidelines today are all based off expert knowledge. We know age matters, we know smoking intensity matters, duration of smoking matters, and you still get some AUC somewhere in the 60s. There, the analogy is that we know way more than these couple of bits. We have many megabytes of information. We have the actual CTs when someone starts screening. There's many million pixel representation, and we know who got cancer over time. And so we can just use the signal directly and see how much more signal can we squeeze out of this for personalized screening use cases. Now, the modeling here is very similar. There's a couple of new things that are separate here. One idea I'll touch back on towards the end is how do you transfer 3D kernels from YouTube videos. I think we can do it better than this, but this was something that was key making it work at the time. And there's also new algorithmic ideas on how to leverage where the cancer will develop in the future to help guide the model today. I won't dwell on this too much, but the key points, the same key ideas lead to both getting much deeper understanding of who's going to get lung cancer than traditional knowledge alone, looking at only the image. And this also generalizes to held out institutions. And so we know the benefit is real. Now, I want to talk about 2 use cases in using this model, which we called CSAIL. So one use case is, as you might imagine from the title of the talk, personalized screening. So as in breast cancer, our current standard of care says everybody gets a CT every year. And so that means for some people, it's not quite enough, and some people it's too much. And what we've shown in this analysis is that if we take the lowest 10% bucket, we could skip a year of screening and miss no cancers. Nothing would have been diagnosed next year anyways. And so that would avoid a fraction of the CTs, 10% of them. And if you look at just the very top 5% of risk, and we say those people come back for 6 months, roughly half the cancers that would have been not found in the screening, someone comes back in the interval, those that generally have worse outcomes would have been flagged. And so we could have, so in a kind of image neutral way, we could have both improved the early detection for these cases while reducing overscreening for people at the bottom of the risk. Now, this is kind of a classic type of use case, and as the models get better, this will continue to get better. And this is the focus of many discussions we're having to design new trials in lung cancer. Now, I want to briefly walk through some of the predictions to help build a little intuition of like, what are these models doing? One hypothesis that many people ran by is like, are they just seeing small nodules, small things that are maybe cancer, and just detecting it better before people see it? And what I'm showing you here are various images of where the right-hand side is when the cancer was found. The left-hand side is when the model found these people to be at very high risk, but the radiologist said there was nothing there. And what you see here is that, sometimes there is a little nodule, like for images C and D, but other times there really, at least, I mean, I can't interpret this myself, but my colleagues tell me there's nothing easily intuitive that makes it high risk that we would want to intervene on, showing that the model does something beyond just looking at visible nodules. Another way to slice that analysis is that we can exclude from the evaluation where the nodules are visible even in hindsight. And what we see here is that even when you exclude it, the model's performance is really non-trivial and still doing quite well. Okay, so there's one more use case and this thing I want to talk about. Another kind of thing beyond personalized screening and kind of like this preemptive thing is also sets up really well for prevention trials. So a key challenge in developing any drugs to reduce the incidence of this kind of cancer is even running the study. And a key use case is just selecting patients who are at high risk enough to benefit from kind of intervention. And this is something that colleagues in the more pharma world have reached out and expressed interest in. And what we see here is like even compared to heavy smokers, things that we kind of colloquially know to be high risk, we can still get a very high enrichment. And surprisingly, we can also get non-trivial accuracy in understanding where the future cancer will develop. And so this implies that there's a possibility to develop more localized preventative measures, which is going to be quite interesting. Okay, so to recap, that was the kind of first chunk of the talk. We really dived into what does it mean to understand who's going to get cancer in the future and how to predict cancer risk. But there's only half of the equation, right? Like you don't want to try to like get foresight, you need to do something about it. And we talked about some simple interventions like who gets an MRI, who gets a supplemental screening. But there's an opportunity to be much more ambitious in thinking how we even think up screening policies in the first place to optimize our objectives. And this is the focus of another paper I'll be discussing today that we had in Nature Medicine, focus on viewing this as a reinforcement learning problem. Okay, so to dive in, as I mentioned earlier, screening today is basically one size fits all. For different people, you get very different outcomes, including both late detection, overscreening. And this is basically the same challenge we see everywhere, where you want to get both less late detection, there's large calls to action to solve that problem, less overscreening, there's large separate community efforts saying we do too much screening. And because these patterns are different across populations, it also sources disparities. So the basic holy grail in the space and what we want to achieve is you want to tailor the regime down to individual patient needs so that we'd have found out for someone like the patient in blue, we've given them something more frequent, that's more sensitive and more fits, so they actually benefit from it. And the patients in green and orange or unlikely to develop cancer who won't actually get it, we would have known to screen them less and would avoid any biopsies. So this is the goal. I think it's also worth discussing how our guideline making works today. So we can kind of assess, is this goal achievable under our current setups? How does guideline design work today? By and large, there's a bunch of different physician organizations like the National Cancer Network, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, ACR, many others. There's expert panel meetings that are run by these organizations. Many meet every 5 years, some every 2 years. They review the literature to say what seems like a good idea, what simulations have been done, have there been any new trial results? Often there aren't. And then given this, they just look at it and say, okay, well, given this, I think we should do every year starting at this age or every 2 years starting at this age. This leads to many different conflicting one-size-fits-all criteria all across the US, and none of these have any explicit validation. So like it's hard to say, oh, we feel that biannual sorting at 40 is the right thing, and actually run that on all the different hospitals in the country and actually get a sense of what that would actually imply and if that fails in some way. It's just consensus, opinion, and guideline. And I will argue that this kind of process will never be able to give you a sophisticated algorithm that looks at evolving health data and the newest AI model and like optimize this thing for you. We're just not set up to do this kind of thing. Now, there is modeling in this process, and it's useful to note how the models are used and what is their structure. There's a network supported by the NCI called CISNet. They build really cool probabilistic models of the full disease. So they say, here are the risk factors, here's how cancer works. Given these risk factors, here's the amount of cancers that will develop. And so then they simulate hypothetical patients being born, aging, getting cancer, and then continuing to age afterwards. And then given these complete assumptions and complete model of how cancer works, they then simulate different screening strategies and then say what they believe is most cost effective and what's the correct trade-off between them. Now, this type of models are used in that they're used to simulate the implications of different models at an aggregate level, like kind of average effects. But I'll argue they're fundamentally limited in twofold. One, it is not possible to incorporate like the full complexity of real cancer into these things. It's easy to miss differences across different groups. It's hard to build in new kinds of risk models, and you can't even evaluate this on real patients. If you want to say, how does this model work at my hospital? That's a very hard question to ask. And so it leads to a very rigid modeling framework. It doesn't give you a lot of room for personalization. So I'll argue that these approaches, while they've been foundational to how we got to where we are today, are not quite enough to get to this truly tailored, personalized regime. But we can actually achieve this with hindsight. And what I mean by that, we're going to reframe this problem as a learning task. And to kind of set that up in some like simple input outputs, we have a patient, we can say we have the risk score. Here I wrote as a single scalar, but in practice, we might have many more numbers. Let's see, we have like the 1-year risk, 2-year risk, the 5. We put that into our policy model. Now, the point here is not to say who's going to get cancer, it's to say what should we do about it. So should you come back in 6 months, a year, 2 years, etc. And given this information, we want to optimize for a reward function. And the reward here is some combination of early detection benefit and screening cost. So this is the overall framework and setup. Now, key insight of this work is that to learn such a policy, we don't need to assume who's going to get cancer. We don't need to have full models of the cancer world. All we need to model and to assume is what we'd rather happen to individual patients with the power of hindsight. So consider again the patient in blue who got screened in year 0, in year 1, and then got a late stage cancer diagnosis at year 2. Given this individual person, we don't need to assume whether they get cancer at all. We already see that in the data. All we need to measure is for a counterfactual simulated policy, i.e., let's say get screened every 6 months, what would you rather have happened to this patient in hindsight? And what would you assume that this would have done? So we can build in our favorite model of cost. Here I'm writing 4 screens as it like number of screens is roughly proportional to number of biopsies, etc. But you can build in as sophisticated a measure as you want to kind of measure the harm of every internal screen based on that person. You can say, well, what would I expect the benefit to be for this individual? Here I have something very simple, just like the month shift in diagnosis date and the various assumptions. But in practice, you can build in whatever you want. If you know the stage of cancer, you know the intervention, you can say, well, it's the expected benefit of this counterfactual. And this is a fundamentally much smaller model than the full CISNet model. You can use people who get cancer. You can use people who didn't get cancer. For them, it's even easier. It's just a cost model, and the benefit is by definition 0. And you can run this across the entire population that's been screened over time in any individual hospital. And because now you can evaluate arbitrary policy, you can now do all kinds of analyses like this: are these things fair? Are they equitable across different populations? How do these different things work on my population? And because you can evaluate, you can also train things. You can learn new policies and find something that is actually optimal and can get you better trade-offs. Okay, so this is the kind of overall framework. We wanted to basically take individuals with the power of hindsight, model what we would want to happen with them instead. So that's giving us a counterfactual estimate of benefit and reward. And given the signal in large populations, we can train policies, we can evaluate on health outcomes populations in different hospitals, and now we have a very rich simulation framework. Now, to make this practical, there's 2 additional ideas I want to talk about. The first idea is, what do you do when you don't have risk assessments at all time steps? So for the astute observer, you might have noticed that if the model takes as input a risk assessment, how do you know what to input as the risk assessment at time step 0.5 when there wasn't one that simulated? There wasn't what they actually observed because there was no mammogram there. How would you know what the policy would have done next? Now, you can't always do this in practice, but both in the context of MIRAI, my ongoing risk models, and the classical ones, they change very smoothly over time. And so what we found is that you can actually impute these missing observations with very low error, and you can measure that error in held out data. Basically, you just learn a network to say, given the risk observations that I see, what's the one that are missing? And you can learn this quite easily and get very tight estimates. And so we do in practice that we have this, what we call a risk progression network, to just say what the risk assessment would have been if it started at 0.8 and ended at 0.9. How smooth is this thing? How well can you infill it? And this is actually very easy to learn. Okay, so now we have a full simulation framework. So we can actually do full rollouts of our policies. That's quite important. If you can't do it in this way and the estimates are very chaotic, it's still okay. You can do something. We can frame it as an offline RL problem and still do lots of stuff. It just makes the learning marginally harder. Okay, but we have that. The next challenge is, how do you actually learn the policies? So one idea, my very first idea looking at the space, is I have hindsight, right? So I can say, what's the optimal set of actions with hindsight, which would be skip every negative screen, get the perfect early detection screen. And you can try to copy that oracle. So you can think of this as imitation learning. You have a target, you have your prediction, and you try to make your prediction match that target. Now, in practice, this is actually a terrible way to learn, does not work at all. And the reason why that is because your risk model is not, I mean, it's better than before, but it's not perfect. And so this target is actually unachievable. And so it collapses to something that is worse than even not doing personalization at all. Instead, we're going to think of this as a reinforcement learning problem. So what I mean by this is, instead of predicting what is the oracle action, we're going to say, given my state, which is my risk assessment, and my action, let's say come back in half a year, estimates me the value of my policy, i.e. this kind of combination of cost and benefits, if I take this action and follow my own best policy afterwards. And like the oracle objective, this is, you can always estimate how well you're going to do. Like, this is actually a fundamentally well-formulated objective. And it means that we can actually train policies in this way quite reliably and get things that are quite a bit better. Now, so this is the kind of first key idea. Treat it as a reinforcement learning problem, learn the benefit of following the policy. It's exactly. And it actually starts looking a lot more like a causal inference problem of, like, given this action, what's the estimated benefit and harm of actually following this? Okay, but in everything I've said so far, we've kind of assumed that we have a fixed ratio of benefit and cost. And fundamentally, this is inherently subjective. We can all disagree on what is the right way to pick the trade-offs between how much early detection benefit, how many late stage morbid treatments avoided, how many lives saved is worth how much screening and screening harm. And these are fundamentally different units. Now, in our current policies, we simply have expert committees pick a trade-off and they'll disagree with each other. And that's how you get all these different guidelines. And I'll argue that the only wrong way to choose this is that it should not be set by the model designer, it should not be set by me for sure. But in practice, we don't need to set it a priori. We can actually support all of them and give optimal policies regardless of what the desired trade-off is. So we're going to change the formulation ever so slightly, where instead of saying that the trade-off is known, we're going to say it's unknown. And so we want to have its input to the model a desired preference, which is a way to weigh the different definitions of cost and benefit. And now training time, we're going to say, optimize me a reward across all combinations of these different preferences. So this comes out, this basically starts looking at a framework called multi-texture reinforcement learning, and practically something called envelope key learning. And I won't belabor the details here, but like it's a great set of algorithms, and you can do this really quite well. Now, I'll jump into the evaluation before moving on to like the kind of what's next and what we're thinking about now. So experimentally, we train this with our colleagues at MGH, same place where I originally built MIRAI. We're going to test it in all the places of longitudinal screening where we have this data over time, so we can do these policy simulations. So this means Emory, which is in Georgia, Karolinska in Sweden, and CGMH in Taiwan. And to start showing you the numbers, so all of these across all the different test sets are quite similar. On the x-axis, I'm showing you here mammograms over mammographic frequency over the years. So more to the right is better, that's less screens. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you early detection benefits relative to the observed screening. So 0 is neutral, more up is better. If you look at the green dots, these look at just the current age-based policies, and age is a very weak personalization signal, right? So you can see like this, you're kind of like living on this line of trade-offs. And if you have a better risk model, you can go up and to the right. And so no matter what you want to achieve, you can do better. So let's say you want to have the overall volume of annual screening. You could get much more early detection by doing so and got roughly on average, this showed like 4 months earlier detection in this data set. If you want to say, you give me something as good as annual screening, we expect you should be able to reduce the overall amount of screening volume by roughly a quarter, which imply a massive cost savings to the health system. And a massive saving more generally to just the number of reducing biopsies and implicit harm in this kind of setup. Now, something I think is really cool and important about the type of framework is it also gives you a way to deploy. Unlike the kind of full graphical models that assume like who's going to get cancer, if someone's interested in this type of framework, they can take it and run it on their own data sets. They can plug in their own definitions of reward and benefit and see, well, you still have to put in a preference in the space of the virtual ones, but you can see how does this do in your data sets? Are the assumptions reasonable to you? What's the operating point that makes the most sense locally, given the local values and considerations? And then this then forms the basis to run prospective trials. So to summarize, what I've talked about here is that we can really think about learning personalized screening policies, not by modeling cancer as a whole, not by doing an average effect, by just modeling individuals. This concept is applicable with arbitrary notions of reward design, so you can make these notions of reward and cost better and better and more holistic. And it's compatible with arbitrary choices of risk model. So the better the underlying image-based models, the better the curve will be. And by doing this, you can get both better early detection and less overscreening. Okay, so this kind of wraps up the prior work side of the talk. Now I want to take a few minutes to talk about what's next and what can we do better. So all of this work, I really think it's really in its infancy. Our current tools, I mean, the clinical tools today really use bits of data. So not even kilobytes, not even megabytes. And what I've shown you here across both breast and lung cancer, looking at megabytes, just a single scan, we can already start doing quite a bit better. But patient care is not a single scan. We know so much more than just a single scan. So now to kind of view this, in a kind of what to me the next major leap is modeling the actual full context of patient care, where we have many gigabytes of data. We have many images over time across many modalities. This is even in just breast cancer. You have mammograms, 3D mammograms, which are called tomosynthesis, MRIs, you have prior biopsies. And modeling all of this context is something we've never been able to do before. And I think it's generally one of the most exciting challenges in modern AI. So to put that in perspective, if you think through, these numbers have changed slightly, but if you think through like the biggest LLMs we think of today as like really large scale, they might look at 100,000 tokens or like subword units that they're modeling. For a reasonable token size, a single CT scan is already over 1 million, and you want to have many of them. So the type of scaling we're looking for is more than 1,000x, and this requires really new building blocks on both the architecture side, new types of self-supervised learning algorithms to model how these things correlate to each other. It's an area of ongoing methodological work. Okay, so I'm not going to like belabor the details on how we do this right now because it's all kind of ongoing, but I'm happy to chat about this and people can reach out if they have questions. But we have some really exciting new results in new types of architectures with key ideas across reversibility and the way you kind of do your self-attention, the way that things communicate, that lets us now model inputs that are over 100x bigger than before. And I think this is going to be really important in scaling to this kind of full signal to reach the full potential of what we have. At the same time, there's really cool opportunities for new types of self-supervised learning algorithms that really make sense in the context of medical imaging directly. So that's one bit. And to recap, as we do better, and as a kind of understanding of cancer over time, both who's going to get cancer, who's going to respond to treatment gets better, the more doors it opens clinically. Another thing that's on the horizon is better control. So what I showed you in the second half of the talk with Tempo, the reinforcement learning model, is that we looked at a risk assessment, and from there we're aiming what to do about it. But in a way that's an arbitrary proxy. In the same way that predicting breast density, the human expert variable, was wrong, going off of risk assessments is also a human proxy for the phenomenon. What we really care about is modeling actions. And I think there's a really great opportunities not only to learn to optimize screening directly from the full multimodal imaging signal and directly predict the kind of causal benefit, like basically taking away the kind of separation between risk assessments and policy design and using this kind of same backbone to try to learn the effect from the retrospective data of when someone gets an MRI, how well does it help? And therefore, what does this mean for the next patients? And I think there's a really, I mean, this is something that's not done in practice today, but I think it's clearly where we need to go. There's an opportunity to do quite a bit better. And so I call like the gap is from risk modeling to really action modeling and modeling real benefits. So I think it's a place where we can do much better across the board. And finally, uh, we don't only need better underlying image tools to understand the patient signal. We don't need better control tools. We also need better evidence generation. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, we're running a randomized trial right now with the colleagues at UMass using MirAI to kind of select people for MRI. Now, the data is early, things are promising, but the only thing we know for sure is that by the time this trial is fully done and written up, I'll have another model. And the other model, vanilla, its results will not apply to this new model. And so is this type of framework and the way we do RCTs today is really wholly incompatible with the assumptions that we have about the AI world in which models continue to get better year over year. And so there's really great opportunities to rethink this process and have adaptive platform trials that assume the ML is going to change over time. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Let's take a step back and kind of think through what are these models actually doing? In the context of the MRI trial and many others where you have an AI model picking who gets supplemental imaging, who gets the treatments, etc., the model itself is not the intervention. It allocates intervention. And so the real effect you're trying to estimate is the effect of the intervention, like an MRI, on that patient. And different models generations will overlap in their decisions. They might call the same patients high risk. And so if you look at the prior models over time, you can actually reuse that data when the parts that overlap with the current model decisions to power your new trial and opens opportunities for adaptive enrollment. And so in our current simulations, essentially the kind of key idea is that as the models get better, they're not fully independent. So you'll be able to make the trials smaller and smaller and make them faster and faster. And that is that's a very different regime. We don't have this today. And this is work I'm very excited to work on with faculty colleague Ahmed Allah and a phenomenal biotech PhD student, Wen Chen, to build this up. I think it's going to be incredibly important in a world in which we have new models all the time. And to close, I want to briefly talk about, what if we succeed? If all these three directions work out, namely better modeling, better control, and better evidence generation, what can we actually achieve? And the breast cancer side, lung cancer, and places where we have screening, I think we really revolutionize the screening criteria. In the context of breast cancer, there's really phenomenal evidence about the impact of things like MRI. And if only we could offer it to the right patient, we could almost end advanced cancer and really change the cancer landscape or reducing screening by huge magnitudes. There'd be a very different world and one that's much better to live in. And so there's many versions of this across the cancers where we already have screening. And the better we do this also opens up new doors for therapeutic development, new doors for prevention, more efficient trials, etc. More generally, when we look at places where screening is not even possible yet, things like pancreatic cancer, the reason why it's not possible is because it's not even cost effective to do so because they're so low risk, we don't know who to even benefit from the screening. The fundamental limitation to that is making risk models and control models that tell us how to do screening efficient enough to make early detection possible there and unblock the current bottlenecks in care. So I think it's one of the most exciting challenges you could be tackling, and I appreciate people's attention. I know I speak fast, but I hope to take questions. I'm ready to kind of shift over.
Adam, thank you so much. I'm really glad that you focused on the types of cancers that you focused on. Certainly breast cancer was I think the incidence is something like 1 in 9 women will be affected by breast cancer. And certainly it's affected a lot of families, including my own. And so I have a particular interest in that. Lung cancer, I think is something like people who develop lung cancer, it's like 4 out of 5 people will, will basically die because of their cancer diagnosis. So obviously early detection on these things is really important. We've had a couple of questions that hopefully will kind of seed some discussions here. In your modeling, were efforts made to look at kind of things like texturization amongst the images, as well as density and other factors, or did you just pour raw data into images with labels into the model and just kind of let it learn what to look for? Can you tell us a little bit more about that element?
Yeah. It's essentially raw images put into the model. There's the only pre-processing was downsampling them slightly because of the architectures of the day and the hardware we had at the time. But it's literally every pixel that we could fit into our GPUs, put through deep learning and trying to learn the association in the most rich way that we can. And I really think this is the future of the space in which, with new architecture like the things I've described, and with continued model innovation, should be able to take every pixel over time and be looking at billions of pixels to learn directly like what actually matters.
And with CT imaging, or even the types of imaging that you showed, very often, like a mammogram, for example, is a 2D projection. So you're taking a three-dimensional object and you're looking at a maximum intensity projection through the tissues. Is there any use of the three-dimensional image volume as
Yeah.
your input?
Yeah, so on all the CT work, those are all 3D first models. So
Okay.
instead of having 2D convolutional kernels, you have 3D kernels. So the models look a lot more like what you see in like video modeling today. So even in the 2D case, like in mammograms, it's not just a single image, it's actually four images,
Yeah.
right? So like you're actually modeling the set of images and how they relate to each other, because you might see something across different angles of the breast. You might be comparing differences across the asymmetries between the two breasts that can be an indicative finding. And so either way, you're trying to model sets. And in CTs, when you look at CTs over time, it gets back to a similar thing. So per CT, you're modeling a volume. But then when you have CTs over time, you would be modeling the relationship between volumes and be able to kind of arbitrarily reason about codependencies. And so at least some very much like highly flexible self-attention style models, because you want to allow dependencies to kind of correlate to each other.
One of the things that we do, I do human neuroimaging using MRI. And one of the things that we struggle with, it's always something we're very concerned about, is subject motion, and then aligning image data to itself to be able to then do our comparisons. Do you have any considerations of that in your modeling, kind of making sure that the images that you're trying to do analyses on are aligned over time so that you can make accurate predictions?
We don't try to address it in a kind of like pre-processing registration kind of step. We try to learn the dependencies directly. So, because what I mean by that is, let's imagine, so like many other things in computer vision, we do lots of pre-training. And so let's imagine you take two CTs and you mask out random chunks of both, and you train the model in the pretext task to infill the missing components. To solve that task implicitly, you need to reason over how do these things relate to each other, both in correspondence, but more generally, what does this context imply about the evolution of the CT in the future? And we tend to stay towards the style where we look at very large data sets to learn what is the correlation structure inside the modality in general, and not trying to force them to register, because many times you can't. Someone could have gained a lot of weight, especially in mammography, like, it's a different angle projection every time. So registration is a very hard thing to kind of make work. And more generally, you don't necessarily only want to look at how does this thing relate to itself over time. It might be relevant how it relates to another nodule altogether in the past. And so we try to take the most flexible approach and just model the whole possible set of intervolume relations.
Right. And so they're in the modeling, you're doing this all kind of within subject, as it were, looking at these changes
Mhm.
within subject and then combining things to make a more of a population generalizable statement. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. All the models take as input a subject, and we want to take as much of the subject context as we can. And then the way we learn that model to be useful by training it across the population. And so the data sets described here are all kind of large in their nature. So the breast cancer work was like something greater than 100,000 mammograms across 50,000 patients.
Yeah.
The new stuff we're building is closer to 1 million mammograms across hundreds of thousands of patients. And in general, like many other things in deep learning, the type of flexible approach that I advocate only is really possible when you plate to scale.
What are some of the considerations? I think you mentioned the type of the machine as a confounding variable. And we run into this in human neuroimaging all the time. If you're using one vendor and you're trying to combine data with another vendor, there can be challenges. I presume that this, is one of probably several different confounding factors for you. Do you have a sense of what some of the other ones might be?
Yeah, I think it especially gets more complicated when we're modeling MRIs. We have a lot of new work in MRI because, what does MRI mean? It's like something different depending on the acquisition settings, which can differ greatly from place to place. Uh, so in general, like given that we know the acquisition characteristics, so we can read that off in the metadata, it's hard to pre-assume which problems will occur. It just means that there's an auditing test suite of like, okay, we know manufacturer can matter. We know within a manufacturer, these different types of sentence can matter, the type of series that are required that matters. And there's a huge space for essentially never-ending exploration to figure out how to make things work given the huge diversity that's there. So one type of framework that we're exploring now, this is in the context of prostate MR, because every place takes totally different series acquisitions. It's even hard to tell which one's which automatically, where the model basically gets to throw, basically, it's trained in one hospital setting. It might have, let's say, 10 types of scan, in which some people will only have 30, some people only have 6. And then on the new hospital, you need to figure out which subsets of scans it's even able to look at, and designing the algorithm in a way that learns its robustness implicitly. And so in general, I would say like this type of robustness is not solved, but it's hard to pre-specify. And so we have the types of perturbations that we know can exist because we know how the signal is acquired. That then sets the auditing tests, and we test against it and continue to come up with new algorithms to then fix it. So the type of thing that I find in mammography, which is just the machine was the only confounder that ended up mattering in practice. By finding it, the fix was easy. And I think finding it is the important step because then you can be creative and fix the algorithm.
What sort of quality control is kind of necessary on the front side to make sure that just the data you're giving it is of a sufficient caliber and fidelity that you don't end up with a kind of garbage in, garbage out problem and, maybe misclassify something as cancer when it's not?
Yeah. So in general, everything that we take in is all stuff that's normally used through clinical care, right? So like, for example, mammography has like quality positioning standards, and like they expect an image to have a certain amount of chest wall involved for it to be a valid image. Otherwise, the radiologist will not be able to make an accurate read. And so in that sense, the quality assurance of what is a valid mammogram is already kind of built into the system. Similarly, like essentially, if the image is good enough for the radiologist to want to use clinically, we consider it to be fair game for us. And the way we gauge of like, are we doing this well is like, is held out to move to new hospitals with no new pre-processing, does it still work? So it's kind of similar to my other answers in that it's hard to pre-specify here are all the rules that the image must satisfy. We say if it's what is the data generation process as it is? How do we simulate it in the type of generalization that we want? Just let's say it's a fully other health systems, and we take those quantities as fixed, and then we try to make it work within this kind of world. And so this means that like we're not guaranteed that the quality assurance standard will be followed the same way across countries, but it's on us to make it work despite that kind of gap. And that gap is an empirical phenomenon that we don't need to assume, we can just measure in practice.
You mentioned other types of cancer there's a kind of a cost effectiveness consideration. There's also maybe even more of a need in some cases with early diagnosis. For example,
Yeah.
like liver or pancreatic cancer, where usually by the time symptoms show up, it's usually pretty late stage when treatment options get very, very, very limited. Do you find that explain a little bit more about what you were commenting on with the pancreatic situation? That seems like a particularly interesting challenge where if you even got the first hints of it, that something like this might be appropriate. Can you explain a little more?
Yeah. So a step back, like let's talk a little bit about like what it would take to make screening feasible in this kind of setting so you can actually catch things early. And the basic thing that you need is you need to have a high enough prevalence within the screen population such that the odds of finding an early stage pancreatic cancer is high enough to justify the inherent harm of screening. So pancreatic cancer is harder because it's not like it's something as easy as a mammogram. It's usually endoscopic ultrasound, which doesn't seem very fun. So you want to have a really high pre-test probability before even giving that exam. Now, because people are not getting regularly screened, imaging is not going to be the solution to get you there. But philosophically, I still think the same type of approach works, which is take literally everything that you have and how much can we squeeze out of that to understand who will actually get disease. So I started a project with some colleagues in Harvard and Denmark. There's a paper in the Nature Medicine led by Chris Sanders' lab that showed that if you just look at so Denmark is a good example to build this technology the first time because they have like whole health records of everyone in the country over decades. And we showed is that by modeling this signal over lifetimes, that the relative risk rate of the people we called high risk was roughly 10x higher than average. So we can actually get a lot of signal off of just the people's diagnoses over their lifetime. And this really just scratches the surface because there's a lot more than we know about patients than just that. For example, in the Danish data, you have what other diseases are people getting co-located, say in the same kind of like zip code and random sampling of them. It gives you a sense of the environmental exposures. You can see things like what are the health trajectories, morbidities in the family. So there's different kinds of graphs that you can overlay. There's many other kinds of observations. And of the data that we already collect in these kind of national health systems, how much further can we go above that 10x? Can we get to the 20? Is unknown. Like we really haven't tried it. It's something I'm trying to work on this year. And it's quite plausible to me that like even without collecting new data, even without the next kind of like blood-based biomarker, et cetera, off of just really like holistic use of the AHRs, we might be able to make it already effective and possible. And it's also something that like as soon as we start getting close and we start being able to make any of them screenable, we can learn more and start broadening the setups accordingly.
I like that idea and utilizing the electronic health records and geolocating people and looking for proximity, clustering of, if your model can take that into account at all, and indicate that just people by where they live may be already at higher risk. That's an intriguing possibility, because you may have certain communities that, for whatever reason, are going to be more susceptible or at greater risk, and your modeling may be ideally positioned to be able to do that.
One thing I'll add to that is that like it's only when we're lucky that there's a single factor that's very explanatory all by itself. Like for example, in lung cancer, smoking is like a uniquely powerful risk factor. And so that by itself can explain a lot. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? It could be a combination of like many small factors. And so, and it could be that that's like simply the ensemble of the million things is what makes things possible. And that's okay because our models can handle that. So we know things like, the local environment probably says something. We can capture that by understanding the full comorbidity trajectory in that place, understand what is that small part of signal. And it's easier to kind of take everything, make something that works, and then go back and try to say, what can we learn from this? What's the simplest version of this? Rather than trying to go something very simple and make it work from there.
I think it's kind of intriguing about the smoking example, because you could think of a example that might be relatively ambiguous about the smoking is people who live in parts of the country where there is high radon, and it can also
Yeah.
be a lung cancer risk. It doesn't necessarily involve smoking, but if you are exposed to
Exactly.
radon over certain periods, then that too could create a problem. Again, some of your modeling might account for that, and be able to tell the difference, which is intriguing.
Yeah, there's a general problem of like how do we even start screening, right? And this actually also remains true in breast and in lung cancer. Like there's a increasing population of young breast cancers that don't even fit within screening guidelines. They're a little too rare for us to screen now, but if we looked at this type of modeling, we should be able to see what is it like, what can we learn to make this effective? It's the same thing in lung cancer. Like there's a growing gap between the screens population, disease population. More and more people are getting into that after smoking. It's a major problem. And if these programs are going to be effective, we need to learn who actually needs the intervention. And we've been using like uh, only a tiny slip of information that we have, and I think there's a huge room to do better.
Where do you think the field will be in 5 years or so? Just, throwing a number out there where screening, the ability to get screened, may evolve and more data is available. I can't recall exactly how many images you were able to utilize in your Emory study, but I was just curious, like, how do you think the data sizes are going to grow and these models will just get more and more sophisticated? How do you see the trajectory of that playing out?
Yeah, I think across all those like the three axes I described of like better modeling, better types of intervention design, like this policy design stuff, and like a better trial framework, we'll all, I mean, if we do our job correctly, we'll all transform a lot in the next 5 years. I think that on the imaging side, every model will look more or less fully longitudinal multimodal. And the amount of like the ability for us to make really sophisticated guidelines in places where screening is already rich and exists, places like lung and breast, will be, I hope, we'll start seeing like quite a bit of larger scale deployments in that. Now, the trouble here is that always these trials are expensive, they take a while, and so I hope that like some conclusive trials will be fully completed by then. We'll start the beginning of like real world implementations and in a more commercial setting. The on the harder disease side, we're modeling the EHR and the networks of EHRs to show the feasibility. It is my personal hope to show the feasibility of this kind of concept across a couple of these settings, also within the same time period. The path of implementation of that is quite a bit more complicated because An image has the advantage of being more or less kind of fixed over time. What I mean by that is like the nature of an X-ray does not like change in
Yeah.
5 years from now. It still means the same thing. Whereas what a particular code might mean in AHR can actually completely change in 5 years from now. And so the type of non-stationarity problems we face when modeling kind of the output of human processes gets much more complicated. And so I think the implications of that work might take a bit longer to flesh out. There's a lot more challenge to solve in the policy design side, how we think about evidence generation. Like a common thing we assume in most trials is if the trial works today, it's going to work 5 years from now. Like we say this about vaccines, right? Like if it works today, we approve it once. We don't do this over and over again. But in practice, like the virus can evolve. And similarly here, like the EHR is evolving. And does the policy still work? It's going to require a different kind of framework. That means like the trial is always running. And it's going to require a huge amount of innovation across many axes.
I'm kind of intrigued by the idea as you were just describing this, that the act of making the measurement can alter the policy, which means that it won't work in 5 years, right? And so not only is the cancer evolving, but the policy by which one is trying to detect it may change as well. And you have this weird sort of like uncertainty principle at work, which means that your algorithms for trying to detect cancer and the policies that is going to follow probably have to continually be updating themselves in order to stay current.
Yeah, they don't need to update, they need to explore. And I think exploration is not something we really think about nowadays. Because let's imagine we have something that even works, but different population, different access to care. And so for some people, it simply does not know, does the same test work in that subpopulation? Then a conservative policy that looks at just what works in the offline data will never recommend them a test. But you don't want to do that because then you're going to like force permanent disparities. And so you'd want to explicitly have rooms for exploration so the model finds the true optimal thing that's closer to the oral to the causal policy. And that's just a different type of framework. We don't have like exploratory policies in the wild, but like in the limits is what we actually need.
One of the whole driving principles behind our biomedical data science innovation lab and this seminar series this year has been on building of partnerships for the development and training of models like this, and how they actually are going to impact the next generation of scientists who are coming along on our heels, who will be using these as a daily tool, as a daily resource for making diagnoses, for using them in clinical decision making, as well as research tools. What advice might you have as somebody who's still relatively young, to the people who are coming behind you who are going to be developing these things moving forward?
Yeah, I think I'll say there's many pieces of advice like flowing through my mind right now. Uh, and I feel like I'm gonna end up with something a little bit too generic. This is my current reflections. Things always take like the basic friction to get anything done is always higher than one expects. Like when I first started working in the breast cancer space, what I thought we'd achieve within the first year was way more than we actually achieved. It took roughly 2 years to get anything done. But once we broke through that wall, once like the model started working, we had many outputs at the same time, and really helped change how the community viewed what's possible in this space. And so my general piece of advice is that it's quite likely that even early on, you'll see things that are clearly broken, clearly suboptimal, it clearly should be possible to do better. Uh, my general recommendation is to maintain that confidence and that fire, just and be patient until you make it work. And that time horizon, how long it takes to make anything work, with the complexity, what it's like to get data, to get global validation sets, all to do all the miscellaneous things beyond just technical work to build a real impact. That's going to take quite a bit of patient perseverance, and to like you need to have both the impatience that the world's not good enough and severe patience to actually do anything in the complicated world that we live in.
Adam Yala from UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco, thank you so much for sharing your work with us, your vision for this stuff. Fascinating work. Really wonderful to have a chance to chat with you and to kind of put a nice capstone on our 2023-2024 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science seminar series for this year. I want to thank everybody who has joined us all year long. This is a labor of love. We have a great team, Gina Kamdar and Hannah Kears, who put this thing together. And I'm just happy to be here to kind of play host and support all of their hard work behind the scenes. And thank you so much to everybody who's contributed to this, including our kind of series sponsors, the UVA Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, UVA College of Arts and Sciences, School of Data Science, and our benefactors from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. Once again, Adam, thank you so much for closing us out this year. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend and have a great summer. We will see you again in the fall.
Thanks.